You assume ancient humans needed shoes fast, or sharp rock would cripple them. That's a fair guess. Ice burns, stone cuts. But some of them didn't wear anything for tens of thousands of years after they should have needed to. Somewhere, on a frozen ridge, a bare foot presses into ice that should tear the skin open, and nothing happens. That single moment breaks the whole fragile foot assumption. So what protected that foot? The bones hint why. Little toes. That's where this starts. Erik Trinkhaus, a physical anthropologist at Washington University in St. Louis who has spent decades handling Ice Age remains firsthand, examined the lesser toe bones from a handful of those skeletons and found they had lost real thickness starting around roughly 26,000 years ago, while the leg bones from those same skeletons stayed just as strong and heavily built as before. Who? That's not supposed to happen. A weaker toe should mean a weaker foot, not a foot that somehow kept moving just fine. It wasn't a weaker foot at all. It was a foot doing less gripping work on its own, which is a very different problem than the one most people would picture. Here's a plain way to think about it. The lesser toes are the ones that curl and grip bare ground with every step, keeping a foot stable on uneven terrain. When something else starts absorbing that job, the toe bones stop needing to stay thick to handle it on their own. That's the whole mechanism. And it's smaller and stranger than it first sounds. That's only the first strange part. The next one is harder to explain away. Trinkhaus later worked with researcher Hong Quan Sheng to study two individual skeletons from opposite sides of the world. One, called Sunghir 1, came from Russia and dates to roughly 27,500 years ago. The other, called Tianyuan 1, came from China and dates to roughly 40,000 years ago. Both showed the same thin, delicate toe bones sitting right next to otherwise sturdy legs. Two continents, two populations with no direct contact between them. The same pattern showing up twice. That's not something easy to explain away as coincidence. Two populations that never met, separated by an entire continent and thousands of miles of terrain, arrived at the same physical trade independently. That's not a shared invention, passed hand to hand around a campfire. It's two separate groups running into the same problem, cold ground wearing down bare feet, and landing on a similar rough solution without ever comparing notes. When something shows up twice in places that couldn't have influenced each other, it usually means the pressure driving it was real and widespread, not a fluke tied to one lucky group. So picture the actual moment this pattern is pointing back toward. A hunter kneels before dawn on frozen ground, the kind of cold that should stop bare skin within minutes. A strip of raw hide gets pulled tight around one foot, then the other, tied off clumsily with a length of sinew. It isn't shaped to the curve of the foot. It isn't comfortable. The knot slips once, gets reteed, slips again lower near the ankle. This isn't a practiced motion. It's someone working out a problem in real time. Cold hands fumbling before the light fully breaks. By midday, and the wrap has gone stiff at the fold, and a thin trickle of cold air works its way in near the heel. There's no stopping to fix it properly. And just a quick retie before pushing on toward higher ground where a small herd was spotted 2 days earlier. The wrap isn't failing exactly, it's just barely holding, which turns out to be exactly enough. The herd is still there when the light finally breaks fully. The walk-in wasn't graceful, and neither foot ever stopped aching completely, but both held together long enough to matter. Back at camp that evening, someone else notices the wrapped feet before anyone says a word about them. No one writes this down, obviously, since writing doesn't exist yet, but a habit like this rarely stays with just one person for long. Somebody else cuts a similar strip, the next cold morning, and the idea moves from one set of feet to another without ever needing to be explained. That wrap is the missing piece. The bones can't show directly, and it never had a real chance to survive long enough to be found. Leather rots. Grass rots faster. Bone is nearly all that's left behind after enough centuries pass. There's a human moment behind the bone measurements, too. And it's worth knowing, since it's easy to imagine researchers setting out looking for the origin of the shoe on purpose. That's not really how it happened. Trinkaus has described the discovery as something closer to an accident, a set of toe bone measurements that simply refused to line up with expectations until they were laid out side by side across several different skeletons at once. Nobody starts a research project asking where shoes came from. Somebody is measuring bones for an entirely different question about mobility or body size, and the pattern insists on being noticed anyway. There's a way researchers rule out other explanations for this, and it's worth knowing, so this doesn't sound like guesswork. Alongside the toe bones, researchers also check the hand bones and finger bones from the same skeletons, bones that have nothing to do with walking at all. If overall health or diet had simply declined, the hands should show a similar drop in bone strength right alongside the feet. They mostly don't. The change sits specifically in the toes, which is exactly the kind of narrow, targeted signal that points toward a real shift in how the foot was being used. But that's still not the strangest evidence in this story. Not every ancient population shows this pattern, and that absence isn't a contradiction. It's actually a clue on its own. Sites closer to the equator, where the ground itself is softer and gentler on skin, we show far less toe thinning across that same rough stretch of time. Populations that never needed to wrap their feet against ice simply kept their thicker, stronger toe bones for much longer. Geography, more than anything else, and decided who needed the trade and who never did. That geographic split lines up closely with something else already known about this period. Human groups pushing into colder, harsher parts of Europe and Asia during roughly that same window needed some kind of foot protection just to survive the terrain long enough to settle it. Groups staying in milder regions felt no such pressure. Seen that way? The toe bone evidence isn't only proof that footwear existed, it's a rough, indirect map of exactly where humans were pushing hardest into unfamiliar ground. That reframes the whole idea of why this happened at all. It wasn't fragility pushing people toward invention. It was ambition pushing people past the edge of what bare feet alone could survive. Every time a group moved into a colder valley, a rockier ridge, or a hunting route stretching further from camp than the season before, a simple wrap bought a little more range. The feet didn't fail first. The reach for new ground came first, and the wrap only existed to keep pace with it afterward. None of that explains the biggest turn in this story yet. Here's the part that actually flips the whole thing on its head. And it isn't what most people expect walking into this. It wasn't the foot demanding a shoe. Something else moved first. The common version of this story goes like this. Feet were too weak for the world, so shoes eventually got invented to fix them. The bone evidence says the opposite order actually happened. Some rough, improvised form of foot protection came first, probably long before anyone would have called it an invention at all, and the foot changed afterward, simply because it no longer had to do all the gripping alone. The tool showed up before biology strictly needed it to. That's backwards from almost every other story about human tools, where the body usually has a problem first, and a fix follows after. Not here. A rough strip of hide reached back across tens of thousands of years and quietly rewrote the shape of a bone. That means the tool led and the body followed, not the other way around. Most technology stories don't work this way at all. A body gets cold, so fire gets discovered and tamed. A stomach can't digest something raw, so cooking gets figured out. The problem usually comes first, sharp and obvious, and the solution follows to meet it directly. Footwear seems to have run in the opposite direction almost by accident. Someone wrapped a foot for one hard walk, with no plan beyond getting through that single day. And tens of thousands of years later, an entire skeleton had quietly reorganized itself around the fact that it no longer had to grip bare ground alone. That's not a small distinction. It means a piece of technology this simple, barely more sophisticated than tying a knot, was already powerful enough to leave a permanent mark on human anatomy long before anyone understood what a tool even was in any formal sense. So what filled the gap between those first thinned toe bones and an actual constructed shoe? Part of the answer is simply that almost nothing from that gap survived at all. Wood splits and rots. Hide decays within a few seasons. Woven plant fiber falls apart even faster. What archaeology recovers is a narrow, biased sliver of everything that once existed, weighted heavily towards stone and bone, with the rare exception of places where ice or dry desert air happened to preserve something whole. Think about how strange that actually is for a moment. An entire span of roughly 35,000 years, packed with generations of people wrapping and rewrapping their feet, refining knots, testing which hide held up longest, against which kind of ground, and almost none of that experimentation left a single physical trace behind. Not because it wasn't happening, but because the very thing that made it useful, cheap, disposable, quick to replace, is exactly what made it vanish so completely. The most important tools in a story like this are sometimes the ones least likely to ever be found. That's part of why a single frozen body in the Alps carries so much weight in this story. It isn't just one data point among many, it's one of the only moments where that entire invisible stretch of experimentation briefly became visible, frozen mid-use on an actual pair of feet instead of guessed at through bone alone. It's worth remembering how much luck sat behind even that one exception surviving at all. A slightly different resting spot on that glacier. A slightly warmer season at any point over 5,000 years. And the ice would have released its grip long enough for scavengers or simple decay to finish the job. That time usually finishes everywhere else. The shoes survived by accident. Not because anyone intended them to be found. That's the uncomfortable part of relying on frozen bodies and lucky preservation to fill in a story this old. The evidence that does exist isn't necessarily the evidence that was most common. It's just the evidence that happened to get lucky. One of those rare exceptions sits in the Alps on a body found frozen roughly 5,300 years ago. It surfaced in 1991 when a pair of hikers noticed something unusual melting out of a shrinking glacier and reported it. Now widely known as the Iceman, his feet were examined in detail through reporting from Smithsonian Magazine, which described a sole cut from bearskin, an upper wrap of deerskin, and a netting of thin bark strips packed tight with dry grass for insulation. That's not an improvised wrap thrown together in a hurry. That's a built object made from separate materials, each doing a separate job. The shoes themselves were barely more than fragments by the time anyone examined them carefully, decayed at the edges, and partly torn apart by the movement of ice over roughly 5,000 years. That made rebuilding them a genuine puzzle rather than a simple sketch. Which parts came from which animal had to be pieced together, strand by strand. Using microscopic examination of the remaining leather to tell bearskin from deerskin, from the cowhide lacing, holding it all together. It gets more convincing than a description on a page. Petr Hlavacek, a professor of shoe technology, rebuilt a working replica of those exact shoes, sourcing bearskin specifically to match the original construction, down to hiring someone to supply hide from an actual bear rather than substituting a different material. He then walked roughly 12 miles across the same rough alpine terrain where the Iceman was found. No blisters afterward. He said the design felt more capable on uneven ground than a modern hiking boot, closer to walking barefoot, but better. A shoe built more than 5,000 years ago, tested today by someone who actually wore it on real terrain, still holds up. It's worth being honest here too, since it's easy to make this sound cleaner and more triumphant than it actually was. A wrap, or even a built shoe, never made ancient life safe in any broad sense. Infection from a small wound near the heel could still turn dangerous fast, long before anyone understood why a cut went bad in the first place. This isn't a story about ancient people being tougher or purer than anyone alive today. It's a story about people adapting with whatever imperfect protection they had on hand and still pushing into ground that should have stopped them cold. Life expectancy across this period was short by any modern standard, and a wrapped foot did nothing to change that on its own. A twisted ankle far from camp, a deep cut that swelled and never fully healed, a slip on ice with no one nearby to help. Any of these could end badly with no warning. The wrap solved exactly one narrow problem: traction and warmth against a hostile surface, and left every other danger of that world fully intact. Go back to that frozen ridge from the very beginning for a second. The bare foot pressing into ice without tearing open. That wasn't toughness pulled out of nowhere. It was a foot that had already been quietly reshaped by tens of thousands of years of a trade. Nobody alive at the time could have explained. Standing on ground, its ancestors could never have crossed without help at all. Cold climate populations much later in history make the same basic pattern easier to see clearly. Constructed boots built from multiple layered materials, designed specifically to trap warm air against the foot in extreme cold, show up again and again wherever people settled into genuinely harsh Arctic environments, from northern Scandinavia to the far reaches of North America. The construction differs from place to place. Sometimes seal skin, sometimes caribou hide, sometimes several layers stitched together for different jobs, but the underlying logic stays the same every time. Soft material against the skin, tougher material against the ground. Warmth trapped in between. That's the same basic logic, sitting inside a strip of hide wrapped around a hunter's foot tens of thousands of years earlier, just carried much further and refined by people who never knew where the idea originally came from. Here's a small thing worth actually trying. Not just hearing about. Stand barefoot on gravel or rough pavement for even 30 seconds. That sting isn't weakness showing up in a soft, modern foot. It's the same ancient trade playing out again in real time, just compressed into 30 seconds instead of tens of thousands of years. There's a reason this keeps echoing into choices people make right now without ever tracing it back this far. The recent pull toward minimalist, barefoot-style shoes is essentially an attempt to run that ancient trade backwards. It rarely moves fast in that direction. Muscle and connective tissue built around a lifetime of cushioned support doesn't rebuild itself in a single season. Even though the original trade may have settled into a hunter's daily habits within one hard winter, going soft took generations to fully set in. Going tough again doesn't move at anywhere close to the same speed. That's not a small detail either. People who switch straight into minimal footwear as adults often end up with sore arches or strained tendons within weeks. Not because the idea is wrong, but because the body underneath has spent an entire lifetime relying on outside support to do work it once handled alone. The trade cuts both ways, and reversing it asks more of the body than most people expect going in and out. It shows up younger than that too. Children who spend a meaningful stretch of early life walking barefoot on natural, uneven ground tend to develop noticeably different foot shape and muscle tone than children who spend most of that same stretch in structured, cushioned footwear, with wider forefeet, stronger arches, and more spread toes showing up in the barefoot group. Neither path is being framed here as the right one. It just means the same trade that started deep in prehistory is still quietly playing out today, compressed into a single childhood instead of tens of thousands of years. None of this is really about which shoes to buy, though it's about noticing that the shape of an ordinary foot, any foot, carries a decision made by someone who never once thought about anatomy, only about getting across frozen ground before the light broke. That decision never announced itself as important at the time. It was just one more cold morning, one more strip of hide, one more short walk toward a herd that might or might not still be there. Nobody kneeling on that ridge could have known a bone would still be carrying the shape of that choice tens of thousands of years later, let alone that someone would eventually dig it up and try to read the story back out of it. That's usually how the biggest shifts in a species work anyway. Nobody votes on them. Nobody announces them. They just accumulate quietly, one cold morning at a time, until enough of them stack up that a completely different kind of foot walks out the other side. Still called a foot, still doing roughly the same job, but built by an entirely different set of pressures than the one it started with. One cold ridge and one clumsy wrap at a time, until the change was too widespread across too many skeletons for anyone studying them centuries later to dismiss as random chance. There's something quietly personal sitting inside that gap, between the toughness those ancient feet needed and the softness feet carry now. It doesn't feel like a fact so much as something the body already half remembered. Feeling that same faint sting on rough ground after a lifetime spent in shoes carries a strange kind of intimacy to it. As Neil Armstrong once put it, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. It's a quiet Tuesday night in Houston right now. Are your own feet as tough as the ones that made that first frozen walk? So, no. Bare feet were never the fragile ones needing rescue to begin with. Something else moved first, and the foot spent tens of thousands of years quietly catching up to it.